This is Act 2 of the Crucible. This lecture is designed to look at the human motivation and why the individual people are doing what it is that they are actually trying to accomplish in Act 2 of the play. I think it's important for us, really, before we get into the detail of John and Elizabeth Proctor's marriage and sort of the language that indicates to us that there's major problems there, is we look at what occurs in the crying out. I'm using this version of the text. So what we see here is this is the Crucible, trying to get it right in the right frame there. This version of the text, it's exactly similar to the one that's in your book. But the crying out, we didn't cover it in class, but this particular portion of the text is where all of that hysteria, all of that craziness, all those personal motivations and issues that have been occurring before now really come to the light of day. And I think that's a good metaphor for the Puritans. We keep everything hidden, everything in darkness. Then when we bring it to light, this certainly becomes more relevant to us. So if we look, Paris is the one that is driving Tituba, the slave from Barbados, to reveal all of the important information. And as many of you had indicated in the beginning of Act 1, she seems really quick to turn. Miller says that her slave sense indicates that she knows when she's in trouble and when the world's really starting to come down on her as an individual. So this is what happens. This is on 47 of this text. The devil, she's in a fury. She's hysterical. We had talked about the meaning of those particular terms. He is the devil. Mr. Paris must be killed. Mr. Paris, no goodly man. Mr. Paris, mean man and no gentle man, and he bid me rise out of my bed and cut your throat. They gasp. Oh my goodness, you're holding the audience right on the edge of their seat. But I tell him, no, I don't hate that man. I don't want to kill that man. But he say, you work for me, Tituba, and I make you free. I give you pretty dress to wear and put you high up in the air, and you can fly back to Barbados. And I say, you lie, devil, you lie. And then he come one stormy night to me, and he say, look, I have white people belonging to me. And I look, and there was Goody Good. This is an extremely important part of the end of Act 1 because Tituba caves in, but look how she caves in. She reveals that she wants to return to the world that she had been from before, where she was free, where she wasn't a slave. Now, this isn't a comment on the idea of Barbados. Like I know Rihanna came from Barbados, all of those things. I know this isn't a commentary on where she came from, but it's a comment on that any life has to be better than the one that she's in. And she's brilliant, or Miller's brilliant, in the fact that he throws other people under the proverbial bus. Tituba blames white people. She says, I have white people worshiping the devil. I see what's going on. And what this does is this feeds into absolutely the central hysteria of the Salem witchcraft issues. It absolutely makes Paris a victim of his own hubris. Now, we talked about hubris in class, the fatal flaw or the hamartia. This makes Paris guilty. He cannot escape anymore from where he is. This is not really a climactic moment for him, but it certainly is a crushing time when he's no longer going to be able to escape from where his problems are. Mrs. Putnam is there, who, again, we had talked about how she's crazy, and they blame Sarah Good. We know that Sarah Good is homeless. She's aged. She's probably senile. We actually have a recorded a record of her death. So we know that she's an actual victim from the Salem witchcraft trials. So, Mrs. Putnam, I knew what Goody Osborne was midwife to me 3 times. I begged you, Thomas, did I not? I begged him not to call Osborne because I feared her. My baby's always shriveled in her hands. Hale, who has been brought in to ferret out that these are all false accusations, is there, but he's a coward. He does absolutely nothing to stop this crying out from occurring. And in my text, there's only one more page right here, over here, of this information left to go over. Abigail says, I want to open myself. They turn to her, startled. She is enraptured, as though in a pearly light. How interesting. She's enraptured as in a pearly light. If you have your books open and you look at this, because everybody in the class should have their book, this is clearly presented. I want the light of God. I want the sweet love of Jesus. I danced for the devil. I saw him. I wrote in his book. I go back to Jesus. I kiss his hand. I saw Sarah Good. I saw Goody Osborne. I saw Bridget Bishop with the devil. This is a huge opportunity for Abigail to get what she wants. But she can't come out right away and say, I believe Elizabeth Proctor was dancing with the devil. She has to set up her plan. This goes to the idea that the play is all about human motivation. Then, of course, Betty Paris is there. She says George Jacobs and Goody Howe. Paris, she speaks. He rushes to embrace Betty. She speaks. The man is not very intelligent. I want to use the word moron, but that may not be the best example. He's so overjoyed that his daughter is miraculously speaking that he can't get over the fact that she might be lying. So again, look at how we've covered this. Betty staring too. She speaks. Glory to God, it is broken. They are free. And Betty calling out hysterically and with great relief. I saw Martha Bellows. I saw Goody Sibber. The marshal, I call the marshal, says Putnam. I saw Alice Barrow with the devil. And Goody Hawkins, Goody Bibber, Goody Booth. On their ecstatic cries, the curtain falls. So the very last page, and we'll go this way, of this play, all of this particular content over here is designed to heighten the hysteria, to heighten the action, to get as many people involved in the conspiracy and the plot as they possibly can. On your paper for the Scarlet Letter and for the Crucible, I have combined these two books, or book and play, into a specific kind of ideas. And I ask you specifically about human motivation. I think it's important at this point to look at a particular model for human motivation, sort of the steps that characters go through to get their satisfaction, if you will, in human motivation. This is a lot of what I did my research on, so if I'm too technical, you can ask me about it in class. I'll go over it again just to make sure. So this model has four major pieces. The first piece is attention. I need your attention. Pay attention to this. If the audience isn't paying attention to the conflict, then no matter what the controversy is, no matter who's involved, they're not going to care. So attention is incredibly important. In the first act of the Crucible, it seems that all of these characters are absolutely sort of glued to one specific idea. They can't escape from their need for gossip, their need for shame, their need for public humiliation. Look here at what we did in the Crucible, where to get people's attention about the pitfalls of sin, we went through and we put Hester on the scaffold. We made her an example. That's why it's ironic at the end of the book that Dimmesdale and Hester and Pearl are all at the scaffold. That same point of shame, and the metaphor changes, and the Scarlet Letter changes, and all of that. In the Crucible, I think there's a lot of those exact same ideas going on, and it's how Arthur Miller grabs our attention. We know he's talking about the Salem witchcraft trials as a metaphor for 1950s Red Scare, communism, trying to get the Red Devil, if you will, out of American homes, out of American businesses, because he felt, Joseph McCarthy felt, that everything was going to go to hell in a handbasket. So that's where we are at the end of Act 1. In a general sense, Act 1 sets up the larger conflict. Act 2 allows us to go through, and now that we've gained our attention, we can go through and we look at individual characters. So the first piece of this model is attention. The second piece is relevance. So at what point do we kind of gather ourselves to human motivation? At what point do we say, oh, that makes sense. Now I know why this character is doing what they're doing. So the second piece of motivational design theory, as I'm going through it now, is relevance. So the characters have to buy in. Well, Puritanism convinced the average human being that if they did not follow God's law to the letter, that covenant of grace, that covenant of redemption, what you had from the Washington State University notes, they're going to go to hell. And they're not chosen, and they're not a good example of the community. We had talked about how Reverend Parris was so concerned about his particular reputation that this created all kinds of problems for him. We examined John Proctor and the guilt that he felt over his affair with Abigail. We examined the Putnams and how each of them had something to lose in the process. Ann Putnam was concerned that 3 of her children had died. Thomas Putnam was concerned about land and money. So every character in Act 1 had a specific motivation, and this gave their individual complaints some major relevance as they went through. Relevance. This is why it matters to them. This is why the Salem witchcraft controversy, the accusations of you're a witch, you trafficked with the devil, this is why that was a perfect opportunity. It was a relevant issue for them. So the issues, the personal grudges, all of that certainly grabbed their attention. It became relevant because each person had their own specific ends that they could achieve. Tituba wanted to go back to Barbados and get away from Paris. Okay, I get that. Putnam's had an issue. Proctor's had an issue. Abigail Williams certainly seems to be the most able to profit from these particular circumstances. The third aspect of motivational design theory is called competence. Do you understand what's going on well enough in the community to be able to manipulate those around you, to be able to manipulate to get what you want? I think this is where we start breaking down our characters, where there aren't too many who are completely aware of what's going on to get what they want, who are competent enough in themselves and what's going on to be able to stay moral or to continue their immoral ways. So when we look at a John Proctor, he certainly in Act 2 has an understanding of what's going on. He has Mary Warren come in and questions her about why she's been gone for so long, why she'd been in town. And Mary says, well, I'm now an officer of the court. I'm supposed to be there. I'm a witness. This, of course, is just a controversy. This is just an opportunity for Mary Warren to say, I'm 18. Even though you're paying for me to be here in this community and you're giving me a place to live and all these particulars, I'm more important. This is what we call teenage angst, A-N-G-S-T. Angst is that need that adolescents have to rebel against authority, whether it is, the church, whether it's their parents, whether it's their bosses, whatever it might be. Angst is that anger. Angst is that need to rebel. Again, A-N-G-S-T. Angst is very important. All of these girls who are manipulated by Abigail or who on their own are kind of going out and doing these bad things, this becomes relevant. They're motivated by angst, whether that's passion, whether it's the need to get back at Elizabeth Proctor, Sarah Good, whatever it might be. These things are important. The fourth level in this model of motivational design theory is satisfaction. After you have realized, or after you've gathered your attention and you understand the relevance and you become competent in all of these issues, you then work to become satisfied. This is just like Maslow's idea of self-actualization. What are you going to do to sort of flesh out what you're going to do with this? Where do you find that important moment in the grand scheme of things that makes you important? So look at your characters. I asked you last week in a quiz, who has the most to lose? Well, I think when we get into Act 2, we certainly have a greater understanding of who has more to lose than others. And so I want you to go through and examine your major players. In your notes, in preparation for a quiz tomorrow, review who has the most to gain now in Act 2 that maybe in Act 1 didn't really have quite that same motivation. I've mentioned Mary Warren, Betty Parris, John Proctor, Elizabeth Proctor, Abigail Williams, and Reverend Parris. So we certainly have those major players. Again, to recap, the model that I used was the ARCS model of motivational design. It's a fancy way of saying it's how we look at attention, relevance, competence, and satisfaction as components for why human beings do what they do and why they're motivated to make the choices that they make. So I think there's a lot of relevant information here. So in Act 2, now start to examine the relationship between John Proctor and his wife Elizabeth. As that scene opens, we become very aware of a marriage in trouble. Now, all kinds of talk shows and research has been out there about why marriages work and why they don't work. We all know that John Proctor had the illicit affair with Abigail Williams. I believe in the text it says it was 7 months ago. This creates the whole undercurrent of why Abigail would do all of her accusations. But now we get a real examination of John Proctor and his wife. The stage directions at the beginning of Act 2 are very important to us. I told you that 80% of what you see in theater is between the lines. It's what characters do. It's facial expression. It's body movements. Miller did a good job here in laying this out. John Proctor comes in after being gone all day, supposedly out planting the very far edge of the field, as he tells his wife. And he goes to the pot of food that's above the stove, or above, they don't have stoves, it'd be above the campfire, and tries it and doesn't like it. I think this is incredibly important. He seasons the food with a little bit of salt, and then Elizabeth comes in. They have the discussion about how the rabbit wandered into the house, but she asks about the food, and the stage directions are very important. She knows, it's like a gigantic elephant in the room that nobody talks about, but everybody knows is there. She knows that she's trying to make him happy. She's trying to please him. And John Proctor knows the exact same thing, so he lies. And he says the food tastes great. It does not admit once to the fact that he seasoned it. We see that mainly as a way for John Proctor to go through and kind of save face and to try and work on repairing the marriage. And it was going fine. It looked like they were having a good conversation, sort of calming the fight that was sort of the storm that's brewing in the background. But then she asks him, where were you all day? Did you go to Salem? And John Proctor at first says, no, I didn't go to Salem. All this stuff is crazy. But then he admits that he was alone with Abigail Williams again, even though he had promised his wife that he wouldn't do such a thing. Now, I can absolutely guarantee you that if I had to make a promise to my wife and I broke that promise, I'd be in deep trouble. Deep trouble. And so it makes sense that Elizabeth kind of flips out on him. Says, well, you told me the truth. You told me that you weren't going to do that, and now you lied, and how do you expect me to trust you? And John Proctor, who we have identified already as the tragic character in this story, as the one with the Marcia, the one with the anagnorisis, the one with the major issues about guilt and all that stuff, he flips out. He says, don't you trust me? He even makes the comment, your justice could freeze beer, saying very clearly that she's such a cold, unforgiving woman that it could freeze alcohol, which has a much lower freezing temperature than does regular water. So that's why that's kind of an interesting point. So then the fight sort of escalates itself. And if you see me looking down, it's because I'm looking at the copy of the text. So they're having the fight. John Proctor talks to his wife about those issues. And then, then Mary Warren comes in. And Mary Warren says, I'm much more important. I'm now a member of the court. So what we're seeing happening here, it sort of right outside of this major fight by John and Elizabeth, is a disruption of the social order. John Proctor and Elizabeth Proctor's marriage is falling apart because of what Abigail Williams is doing. Mary Warren somehow gets herself involved in the process, and it starts to go crazy at that particular point. So in this text, 54, is where Elizabeth accuses John Proctor. She says, for a moment alone why then, it is not as you told me. his anger rising. For a moment, I say, the others came in soon after. She has suddenly lost all faith in him. Do as you wish, then. She starts to turn. Woman, I'll not have your suspicion anymore. I'll not have it. Then let you not earn it. You doubt me yet? John, if it were not Abigail that you must go to her, would you falter? I think not. Elizabeth basically calls John out and says, you would go to Salem and end this whole thing if it wasn't for that illicit affair you had with Abigail. That's the reason why you can't end this entire plot. This is why, in short, you are a coward. So we now see that Elizabeth might have a better understanding of what's really going on in the play than any other particular characters. Mary Warren comes in all sick. Oh, this is terrible. Look at me. I can't believe these kinds of things. Talks about sending the spirit out. Mary Warren reveals that 39 people have been accused of witchcraft over this one stupid little thing. And I use the word stupid here on purpose because had John Proctor admitted to the affair with Abigail, regardless of what it did to his sense of pride, his fatal flaw, then this whole thing would have been over. But now 39 people have been accused. Why, she's weeping. What ails you, child? Goody Osborne will hang. The deputy governor will permit it. He sentenced her, he must, to ameliorate it, but not Sarah Good. For Sarah Good confessed. Sarah Good and, who's the other one? Goody Osborne. One will hang, one will not. The one that confessed to witchcraft said, yes, absolutely, I've done that. Kind of like Tituba did, I think, at the beginning of this particular act. I think this is important because characters are trying to get out of it. So they're admitting to this false sin. Again, I think reflects the Puritans. Mary Warren then says that she, in horror at the memories, she sometimes made a compact with Lucifer and wrote his name in his black book with her blood and bound herself to torment Christians till God's thrown down. And we all must worship hell forever. Proctor then says, but surely you know what a jabberer she is. Did you tell them that? Or did you only give the little tiny bit of information that suited your purpose? This is, you're telling the truth, but not the whole truth. So you can't help you, God. You're telling just what that little bit that you want in order to save yourself in the grand process. I think, again, this is huge. Mary Warren, oh, she tried to kill me. Many times, Goody Proctor. Why, I never heard you mention that before. Elizabeth and John, again, are very particular about what's occurring. They even accused Sarah Good of mumbling when she tried to beg for food. Then we mentioned, of course, that Mary Warren, that's why I told Judge Hathorne, he says so, Sarah Good. They'll not hang them if they confess. And Mary Warren completely revolts. So, subtext, a lot of stuff going on here with Mary Warren, Elizabeth, and John Proctor. That's sort of the first part of Act 2. What occurs next, of course, is when Ezekiel Cheever and Giles Corey come in. And what I think is important about the details in Act 2 is, what do we learn? What is it that we learn about Hale? What do we learn about the role of Mary Warren? What do we learn about Giles Corey and Francis Nurse? I'm sorry, it wasn't Ezekiel Cheever. Cheever's just an officer of the court who's kind of just trying to do his job. So, let me back up there a little bit. What's the role of Mary Warren? She's an adolescent teen angst. I already went over that. I find Mary extremely important because she gives Elizabeth a poppet. A poppet is a doll. It's a little creature that girls play with in order to be cute. Now, if we look here, this is a marionette puppy. This is very much a poppet in the sense of what they're talking about in the Crucible. See, this is my daughter's. I don't play with it too well, so I think that's important, this idea of the poppet. Now, this is a voodoo doll, as we're familiar with the context of how it works. So this doll was made at the court when all of this testimony was going on. Mary Warren brings it back into the house and gives it to Elizabeth, seemingly innocently. I think that's a bunch of garbage, to be completely honest. I think Mary Warren is trying to manipulate the situation, just like Abigail was all throughout Act 1. So this Poppet makes it into the house, and then when Cheever comes back to arrest Elizabeth Proctor for being a witch, the evidence is that this puppet now has a needle in its stomach, and Abigail, while at the court, mysteriously had a needle in her stomach. I go again to that idea of angst of girls when they want revenge and the fact that this was all a setup. But it's coincidence, too. It's almost like, look how naturally these kinds of things occur. And for a bunch of naive pilgrims, naive Puritans sitting there saying, I'm so afraid of the devil, I don't know what to do. This is important. They're easily manipulated. And again, I think that's important. And the guy that misses the whole picture, misses all these details, is Reverend Hale. As smart as that man is supposed to be, he's really dumb when it comes to why people do what they do. And so perhaps he's tragic too in this story. We had talked about John Proctor being tragic. You could consider Reverend Paris. Certainly you're not going to think about Abigail or any of the girls. But again, these are all those things that I think are important for you to pay attention to. So when Hale comes in, after the Poppet incident, he asks John Proctor some questions. I'm jumping around a little bit. The Poppet incident may be after Reverend Hale asked the question. But again, the detail is Hale asked Proctor two questions. He asked him, one, why do you fail to keep the Sabbath day? And then he asks him if he knows his 10 Commandments. This is a big moment because Hale is looking for any shred of proof to let Elizabeth and John off the hook. This is really an out for them. But it goes to the guilt that John Proctor feels because of what he's done. Why don't you go to church on the Sabbath? And what's revealed is that John Proctor says, I can't stand Reverend Paris. I can't stand his sermons. I can't stand how he thinks of his position in the church. None of those things seem to make any sense anymore to him. For example, he tells a story about how before Proctor came, there were pewter candlesticks. Pewter was relatively inexpensive. Still looks pretty nice. Ironically enough, most of the pewter made prior to the 1960s has lead in it. I remember when I was going to Europe and I studied, the son of the professor I went with had a Warcraft set of figures, and when you buy them in Europe, the pewter has lead. You buy them in the United States, you can't get the figures with lead in them. Gee, I wonder why. I mean, it causes brain damage and birth defects and all that kinds of stuff. So, pewter. A little tangent there. Might show up as extra credit. Who knows? So, the pewter candlesticks. Then, after Paris was there, Proctor says that Paris did nothing but preach for months about how he wanted a set of gold candlesticks for the altar. It's a big deal. Gold is expensive. A minister is not supposed to sort of market himself so that he has gold everything, so that he has nicer stuff than anybody else. You know, that idea that somebody religious shouldn't be driving around in a Corvette, especially with vows of poverty and those kinds of things. So this is important. So Proctor says there is hypocrisy in Paris, and I want nothing to do with that particular hypocrisy. That's a big deal. Remember, in the beginning of the play, in the stage descriptions for John Proctor, he has a hard and biting way with hypocrites. So he's not going to like Paris, and this is even more of an example. Hale should have caught on to this. Hale should have realized that this is kind of a big deal and that there are important concepts here that he should pay attention to. But he misses the point. He's more bogged down in the fact that good Puritans all go to church on the Sabbath. Even though John Proctor says, I can worship God here in my house. That worshiping God in all things, the Gerald Manley Hopkins, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. Well, apparently, if you were a Puritan, or a Paris in particular, It wasn't good enough to see God in the grandeur of all things. It was important only to go to church, pay your tithe, make sure he has golden candlesticks. The second major incident that sort of gets Proctor on the hook, and it's not a very good example for him, is that when Reverend Hale says, okay, fine, I'll let you off the hook if you can tell me your 10 commandments. And he goes through all the commandments and he can't remember one of them. And this is tremendously ironic for the play. The one he can't remember, of course, is adultery. Elizabeth has to point it out to him, and it's crazy because right there it undermines every motive that Proctor has. Every reason he has to avoid sort of his choices. This is why he's a tragic character. He keeps avoiding that one opportunity he has to sort of give up the goods, to say, yes, it was me. Yes, it's my fault. Let's put all of these witchcraft things to end. He's a tragic character because it is his fault that all of these things occur. So commandments, he leaves out adultery. Why is that ironic? I wrote that down in my notes as I was preparing this lecture for you. Then at the end of Act 2, we deal with Giles Corey and Francis Nurse. Those two characters who at the beginning were supposed to be good examples of the community. Giles Corey or Giles Corey, it depends on your pronunciation. Again, I think this is important. He's the old guy, the 83-year-old. He's married to Martha. Now, of course, in the beginning, Martha is accused of reading. God forbid that women would do reading and become intelligent and have freedom and all these kinds of things. Certainly not a modern concept. But Giles was concerned that his wife was spending too much time reading, that she was going to get smarter than he was, and he wouldn't, or she wouldn't take care of him anymore. A pretty simple, I just don't want my wife to read books because she's not going to be interested in me anymore. Potentially completely without malice. Potentially not an action on Giles' part to cause any problems, but ironically enough, like a lot of things that I think happen in this play, that doesn't work out. He doesn't have that opportunity to escape from that moment of stupidity. So that's important. Accuses her of reading. And then Francis Nurse is all of that false accusation based on land, based on I'm a good moral character, but we know that the Putnams are out for land. We know that they're trying to create all of these particular problems for us as we go through the particular story. So this takes us really through all of the information in Act 2 of the play. We know that Rebecca is charged in this text on page 71. It's right. Oh, sorry, it's on this side. Sorry, over here. It says, how is Rebecca charged, Mr. Nurse? Bring it over here so we can see it. Then it goes on. With a mocking, half-hearted laugh, for murder she's charged, mockingly quoting the warrant. For the marvelous and supernatural murder of Goody Putnam's babies. What am I to do, Mr. Hale? Of course, we know that this is completely false, but it's the perfect time for such an accusation to take hold when everybody's being crazy and goofy and all these kinds of things. Hale turns from Francis, deeply troubled. Believe me, Mr. Nurse, if Rebecca Nurse be tainted, then nothing's left to stop the whole green world from burning. Let you rest upon the justice of the court. The court will send her home, I know it, will acquit her. Now, I find it incredibly important that earlier in Act 2, Proctor makes the comment to Elizabeth that your justice would freeze beer, and I already talked about it. This is another one of those examples, the cold justice of the court. The hypocrisy of those in charge certainly is not going to deliver Rebecca Nurse from these false accusations. We know that. That's the irony of the play, that when left to human motivation, it creates a huge issue. Then Abigail Williams charges Elizabeth. Oh, God, who would have thought she would have done such a thing? Do you see the sarcasm on my face here? Can you believe that, oh, my God, Elizabeth Proctor found the right moment? And then that's with the poppet, with the needle in the stomach. Everything tends to be escalating here to the point where it's a problem. Hale, again, doesn't get it. So At the very end of Act 2, Proctor grabs Mary Warren by the throat. He can no longer control his temper. Again, probably part of his fatal flaw that he can no longer hold it together at this point. It says, grasping her by the throat as though he would strangle her. Make your peace with it. Now hell and heaven grapple on our backs, and all our old pretense is ripped away. Make your peace. He throws her to the floor where she sobs. I cannot. And now, half to himself staring, and turning to the open door, peace. It is a providence and no great change. We are only what we always were, but naked now. What a great line. We are only what we always were, but naked now. Remember that this play is a study in human motivation. This whole concept of the crucible where we burn away the impurities to leave a purer substance left behind. John Proctor, here at the end of Act 2, certainly seems to make that comment. So if I go over here to my crucible, if you will, my ashes of problem students, where we burn away the chaff and we put all those things in there. It's currently empty. I'm waiting for the opportunity to put more in there, of course. But I think this, again, gives us a huge opportunity at the end to kind of talk about what's going on. But naked now, he walks as though toward a great horror, facing the open sky. I naked, and the wind, God's icy wind, will blow. Oh, I have guilt. I realize now the effects of what I've done, and now this creates a huge problem. Seems to make sense for Act 2. Now, your homework for Wednesday is to read Act 3. I'm going to finish this play this week. You've got a paper on the Scarlet Letter and the Crucible due next week. So that's ultimately what I need you to be able to do. Now, I'm going to offer you a suggestion. Years ago on SparkNotes.com, God forbid, SparkNotes, under their important quotes explained section, they have several really important quotes. Then they go through and they explain in the context of the play what they might mean. I want you to get those 5 quotes, write them down in your notes, and be able to discuss them when you come back on Wednesday. That's part of your homework. So it's the Crucible at SparkNotes.com under Important Quotes Explained. So that way you can use those resources on your own so that you can get the content. So read Act 3 for tomorrow's class. Look up those major quotes and work on your paper. That is the major goal for the next couple of days. The next project after you write this paper and take a test on the Crucible is going to be American Romanticism, and we'll spend probably 6 weeks, 7 weeks on Romanticism all the way through to the end of the semester. It's my favorite material to cover, so I think certainly it's going to give us an opportunity to look at some good stuff. That's more the creative, imaginative materials that are of value. Also remember that I will be on the 14th through 17th of November. I will be at the JSCA National Technology Coordinators Conference, so I will not have the opportunity to be in class, and we'll do more lectures like this. So I'm currently at 38 minutes and 13 seconds. I'm going to post this on Moodle. I'll post a homework assignment to be completed based upon this lecture also on Moodle, and it'll be labeled as homework. It's only available, I think, after 4 p.m. on Tuesday. So you want to make sure that you go and you get that submitted by 12 midnight on Tuesday night, early Wednesday morning, so that I have the opportunity to go through and grade it. That's my expectation. Hopefully I held your attention during all of this and I kept it interesting. If not, you can always go back and review things that you have missed so that you don't end up in a tremendous amount of trouble. So with that, have a great day. Good luck in covering these notes. Simply, I've just gone through all of Act 2. So make sure you read it and you pay attention. Have a good day.